Richard Wellington considered himself a man of importance. At 52 years old, he had built a moderately successful property development business in Manchester and had grown accustomed to people accommodating his demands and accepting his authority without question. His sense of entitlement had been carefully cultivated over decades of being surrounded by employees who depended on his approval and business associates, who tolerated his arrogance because of his financial influence. On this particular morning, in late September, Wellington found himself in London for what he described as important business meetings. Though in reality he was attending a property investment conference that anyone could register for online. He had dressed in his most expensive suit-tailored navy blue creation that had cost more than many people earned in a month, and wore his gold watch and matching cufflinks as symbols of what he considered his elevated status in society. Wellington had decided to spend his morning touring the traditional tourist attractions around Westminster, not out of genuine interest in British history or culture, but because he felt it was appropriate for someone of his standing to be seen at such prestigious locations. He carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the world should arrange itself around his convenience, completely oblivious to how his behavior appeared to others. The morning was crisp and clear. Perfect weather for the traditional ceremonies that drew thousands of visitors to London's royal palaces and military installations. Westminster was bustling with its usual mix of tourists, locals heading to work, and the various ceremonial activities that made London such a unique capital city. The atmosphere was respectful and orderly, with most visitors understanding that they were witnessing traditions that had been maintained for centuries at Wellington Barracks. The Grenadier Guards were preparing for their daily march to Buckingham Palace, a ceremony that had been performed with precision and pride for generations. The Guards, resplendent in their red tunics and towering bearskin caps, represented not just military tradition, but the very essence of British ceremonial excellence. Their preparation was meticulous, their discipline absolute, and their pride in their service evident in every perfectly executed movement. Leading the formation was Colour Sergeant David Thompson, a 23-year veteran of the Grenadier Guards who had served with distinction in Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Before earning his current ceremonial position, Thompson embodied everything that the Guards represented in wavering discipline, his absolute professionalism, and complete dedication to maintaining the standards that had been passed down through generations of soldiers. The route from Wellington Barracks to Buckingham Palace was well established and clearly marked, with barriers and signs directing pedestrian traffic away from the marching path. Tourist guides regularly explained to visitors that when the Guards were marching, the route must be kept clear for security and ceremonial reasons. Most visitors understood and respected these requirements, viewing the precision and tradition of the march as a privilege to witness. But Richard Wellington had never been the type of person to concern himself with rules or traditions that he felt didn't apply to him. As he walked through the streets near St. James's Park, he became increasingly irritated by what he perceived as the inconvenience of having to navigate around crowds and barriers. In his mind, these ceremonial activities were quaint tourist attractions that shouldn't interfere with the important business of people like himself. Wellington's frustration grew as he found his preferred route blocked by barriers directing pedestrians to alternative paths. He could see the clear, wide street that the Guards would use for their march, and in his entitled mindset, he couldn't understand why he should have to take a longer route when a perfectly good street was sitting empty. The concept that this space was reserved for a specific ceremonial purpose simply didn't register as legitimate in his self-centered worldview. As Wellington approached the intersection where the Guards' marching route crossed a major pedestrian thoroughfare, he could hear the distant sound of military music and the rhythmic sound of marching feet. The crowds around him began to gather along the sides of the street, excited to witness the ceremony and respectfully positioning themselves behind the designated barriers. Wellington, however, had different plans. Looking at his expensive watch and calculating that waiting for the Guards to pass would delay his schedule by several minutes, he made a decision that would change his morning dramatically. Instead of joining the respectful crowd of observers, he decided that his time was too valuable to waste waiting for what he dismissively thought of as a bunch of toy soldiers playing dress-up. The sound of the approaching guards grew louder as Wellington made his fateful decision. The Grenadier Guards were marching in perfect formation, their boots striking the pavement in synchronized precision that had been drilled into them through countless hours of practice. The regimental band played traditional military marches, and the entire procession moved with the dignity and authority that had characterized British military ceremonies for centuries. Color Sergeant Thompson led his men with the bearing of someone who took immense pride in maintaining traditions that connected the modern British Army to its illustrious history. Every step was measured, every movement deliberate, and every aspect of the ceremony performed to the exacting standards that the Guards had maintained through wars, peace, and changing times. The formation was approaching the intersection where Wellington waited. Thompson's experienced eye automatically scanned the route ahead for any obstacles or execute concerns. The crowd of tourists and locals had gathered respectfully along the sidewalks, many taking photographs and videos of the impressive ceremony. Children pointed excitedly at the tall bearskin caps and brilliant red uniforms, while adults explained the historical significance of what they were witnessing. The atmosphere was one of appreciation and respect for a tradition that represented the continuity of British military service and royal ceremonial duties, but Wellington had no interest in tradition or respect. As the Guards approached the intersection, he looked both ways briefly, saw that he could cross the street quickly, and stepped deliberately into the marching path of the oncoming formation. In his mind, this was simply a matter of practical efficiency. He needed to cross the street. The street was there, and he wasn't going to wait for anyone's convenience. "Excuse me," he called out dismissively as he began walking directly across the route, seemingly oblivious to the fact that an entire formation of elite soldiers was bearing down on him with military precision. "I need to get through here." Crowd of spectators gasped audibly as they witnessed Wellington's breathtaking display of disrespect and stupidity. Several people immediately began calling out warnings, trying to alert him to the seriousness of what he was doing. But Wellington, confident in his own self-importance, continued walking at his own leisurely pace across the street, apparently expecting the entire ceremony to adjust itself around his schedule. Color Sergeant Thompson faced a situation that, while not unprecedented, required immediate decision-making that balanced respect for ceremony, public safety, and military discipline. The Guards had procedures for dealing with obstacles in their path, but those procedures assumed that obstacles were unintentional rather than the result of deliberate arrogance and disrespect. "Make way," Thompson commanded in a voice that carried absolute authority and could be heard clearly over the sound of the band and marching feet. "Clear the route immediately." But Wellington, incredibly, seemed to interpret this command as applying to someone other than himself. He continued his casual stroll across the marching route, even turning to glance at the approaching Guards with what appeared to be mild irritation that their noise was disturbing his peaceful walk. His complete disconnect from the reality of the situation was evident to everyone watching except himself. The Guards continued their advance with unwavering discipline, maintaining their formation and cadence exactly as they had been trained to do. Their commitment to ceremonial protocol was absolute, and the idea of breaking formation or altering their march for someone who was willfully obstructing their path went against everything they had been taught about maintaining the dignity and continuity of their traditions. As Wellington reached the center of the marching route, still walking at his own unhurried pace and apparently oblivious to the approaching formation, the crowd's gasps turned to shouts of warning and disbelief. Tourists were pulling out their phones to record what was clearly going to be an extraordinary confrontation between entitled civilian arrogance and unwavering military discipline. "Sir, move immediately," Thompson shouted again, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly and without question. "You're obstructing a military formation." Wellington finally turned to look directly at the approaching Guards, and for the first time seemed to register that they were not going to stop or alter their course for his convenience. But instead of quickly moving out of the way as any reasonable person would do, his entitlement and arrogance kicked into high gear. The idea that these soldiers expected him to accommodate their schedule rather than the other way around struck him as completely unreasonable. What happened next would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it as one of the most spectacular displays of entitled arrogance. Meeting immovable military discipline that they had ever seen, instead of quickly stepping aside when he finally understood the situation. Wellington actually stopped walking and turned to face the approaching guards with an expression of indignant outrage. "Now see here," Wellington called out, holding up his hand as if he could simply command the entire formation to halt for his convenience. "I'm trying to cross the street here. You'll have to wait a moment while I finish what I'm doing." The crowd's collective gasp was audible even over the sound of the military band. Children stared in amazement while adults covered their mouths in shock at the breathtaking audacity of what they were witnessing. Here was a middle-aged man in an expensive suit actually attempting to order an entire formation of elite British Navy soldiers to accommodate his personal schedule. Color Sergeant Thompson, with decades of military experience and the authority that came with his position, made an instant decision that would demonstrate exactly why the guards had maintained their reputation for unwavering discipline and ceremonial excellence. The formation would continue exactly as planned, maintaining the precision and dignity that had characterized British military ceremonies for centuries. "Forward march," Thompson commanded, and the formation continued its advance without the slightest deviation in pace, rhythm, or formation. The guards had been trained to maintain their ceremonial duties regardless of obstacles, and Wellington's presumptuous demand that they halt for his convenience was not going to alter centuries of military tradition. Wellington's face showed complete shock as he realized that the guards were not going to stop. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was facing a situation where his sense of entitlement and expectation of special treatment were going to be completely ignored. The approaching formation represented an immovable object meeting what Wellington had always assumed was an irresistible force, his own self-importance. "Stop," Wellington shouted, his voice now showing panic as he began to understand that his commands were being completely disregarded. "I said, wait, don't you know who I am?" But the guards continued their advance with mechanical precision. Color Sergeant Thompson's expression remained fixed straight ahead, showing no acknowledgement of Wellington's demands beyond the commands he had already given for the route to be cleared. The formation moved like a perfectly calibrated machine, each soldier maintaining his position and pace with the discipline that had been drilled into them through countless hours of training. As the front rank of the formation reached Wellington's position, something had to give. Wellington, finally grasping that his commands were being completely ignored and that the soldiers were not going to alter their march for his convenience, made a panicked decision to stand his ground and demand recognition of his authority. "I'm a successful businessman," he shouted desperately. "Can't just ignore me. I pay taxes that fund your salaries." But Wellington had fundamentally misunderstood both the nature of military discipline and the physics of what was about to happen. The guards were not going to break formation, alter their pace, or acknowledge his demands. They were going to continue their march exactly as trained. And anything in their path that refused to move was going to discover what happened when civilian entitlement met military determination. Color Sergeant Thompson, leading the formation, approached Wellington's position without breaking stride. His years of experience had taught him that maintaining ceremonial protocols sometimes required making examples of people who showed disrespect for military traditions and royal ceremonies. Wellington had been given multiple opportunities to remove himself from the path, had ignored clear commands, and was now going to learn a lesson about the consequences of his arrogance. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as the inevitable collision approached. Wellington, still apparently believing that his mere presence and demands would cause the formation to halt, remained standing directly in the path of the advancing soldiers, his face showing a mixture of panic and indignant rage that his authority was being so thoroughly disregarded. What happened next would be recorded on dozens of phones and cameras, creating a viral video that would be viewed millions of times as an example of what occurs when insufferable entitlement meets unwavering military discipline. Color Sergeant Thompson reached Wellington's position, and without breaking stride or acknowledging his presence beyond what military protocol required, delivered what became known as the most professionally executed trampling in the history of British ceremonial duties. With the precision that had made the Guards famous worldwide, Thompson stepped directly through Wellington's position, treating him exactly as he would any other obstacle that refused to clear the designated route. The impact was immediate and spectacular. Wellington, who had expected his demands to be acknowledged and accommodated, instead found himself knocked completely off his feet by a soldier, who outweighed him by 40 pounds and was moving with the momentum of perfect military precision. The expensive suit that Wellington had worn as a symbol of his importance proved utterly inadequate protection against the reality of military discipline and action. Wellington hit the pavement hard, his dignity scattered across the street along. With his gold watch, which flew from his wrist and skittered across the asphalt, his carefully styled hair was disheveled, his suit was torn and dirty, and his sense of self-importance was thoroughly demolished by the simple reality that his demands had been completely ignored by people who served something greater than his personal convenience. But the formation was not finished with him. The Guards maintained their precise spacing and rhythm, which meant that the soldiers following Thompson also had to navigate around or through the obstacle that Wellington had created by refusing to clear the route. Each guard who passed maintained perfect ceremonial protocol, treating Wellington exactly as military regulations specified, as an obstruction to be overcome while preserving the dignity and continuity of the ceremony. The second guard stepped around Wellington's sprawled form with mechanical precision, his boot landing mere inches from Wellington's head as he maintained the exact spacing and timing required by ceremonial protocol. The third guard followed suit, and then the fourth, creating a stream of perfectly disciplined soldiers flowing around and occasionally over the man who had assumed they would accommodate his schedule. Wellington, lying on the pavement in his expensive but now ruined suit, found himself staring up at an endless parade of towering bearskin caps and immaculate red uniforms. Passing by without the slightest acknowledgement of his existence, the soldiers' faces remained fixed straight ahead, their expressions showing the same professional indifference they would display toward any other obstacle that had been properly cleared from their path. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of amazement, laughter, and applause. Many spectators had never seen such a perfect demonstration of what happened when someone's inflated sense of self-importance collided with genuine authority and unwavering discipline. The tourists who had been respectfully observing the ceremony from the designated areas were witnessing a real-time lesson in the consequences of arrogance and disrespect. "Serves him right," called out an elderly woman who had been watching from the sidewalk. "Bloody entitled fool thought the whole world should stop for him." "That's what happens when you don't respect our soldiers," added a man with a distinctive London accent, speaking loud enough for Wellington to hear from his position on the pavement. "They don't break formation for anyone, especially not for some tosser who thinks he's special." Children in the crowd were pointing and asking their parents to explain what they had just witnessed. The educational value of the moment was not lost on the adults, to explain that sometimes people needed to learn lessons about respect and consequences when they refused to listen to reasonable requests. Wellington struggled to get to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage. His expensive suit was torn at the knees and elbows, his shirt was dirty, and his carefully cultivated image of success and importance lay in tatters around him. But perhaps most humiliating of all was the realization that his demands for recognition and special treatment had been so thoroughly ignored that he might as well have been invisible. "Outrageous," Wellington shouted as he finally managed to stand, though his voice cracked with the strain of his humiliation. "I'll have you all court-martialed. I'll sue the entire British Army." But his threats fell on deaf ears. The Guards continued their march with perfect precision, and the crowd continued to watch with fascination and amusement. Wellington had become the entertainment rather than the inconvenienced victim he imagined himself to be, and his continued outrage only added to the spectacle he had created through his own arrogance and stupidity. As Wellington stood in his ruined suit, brushing dirt from his torn clothing and trying to salvage what remained of his dignity, he became aware that dozens of phones and cameras had recorded every moment of his humiliation. The crowd that had gathered to watch the ceremonial march, had instead witnessed what would quickly become one of the most viral videos of entitled behavior meeting its inevitable consequences. "Did you get all of that?" asked a young woman with an American accent. Speaking to her friend who had been recording with her phone, "That was absolutely incredible. He actually thought they would stop marching for him." "Posted it already," her friend replied, still filming as Wellington attempted to collect his scattered belongings. "This is going to be everywhere by tonight. Look at him still acting like he's the victim." Wellington could hear the comments from the crowd, and his embarrassment was quickly being replaced by rage. In his mind, he was the wronged party in this situation. He had simply tried to cross a public street, and instead of receiving the courtesy and accommodation he deserved as a tax-paying citizen, he had been assaulted by government employees who would soon face the consequences of their actions. A police officer approached the scene, having been alerted by the commotion and the growing crowd of onlookers. Constable Maria Santos had worked the Westminster beat for 5 years and had seen every conceivable type of tourist incident and ceremonial disruption. However, she had never encountered someone who had so deliberately and spectacularly interfered with a military ceremony. Sir Constable Santos addressed Wellington as he continued to brush dirt from his suit. "I need to speak with you about what just happened here." Wellington's face lit up with vindication. Finally, he thought, someone in authority was going to address the outrageous treatment he had received. "Officer, I want to file assault charges immediately," he declared, pointing toward the departing formation of guards. "Those soldiers attacked me for no reason. I was simply trying to cross the street, and they knocked me down and trampled me." Constable Santos consulted her notebook and looked around at the crowd of witnesses, many of whom were still recording the aftermath of the incident. "Sir, can you explain why you were in the middle of the ceremonial route when the guards were clearly marching through? I needed to cross the street," Wellington replied, as if this explanation was completely reasonable. "I have important business to attend to, and I wasn't going to wait around for some tourist show to finish. They should have stopped when I asked them to." The constable's expression showed the patience that came from dealing with difficult members of the public on a daily basis. "Sir, the ceremonial routes are clearly marked and cordoned off. There are designated crossing points and alternative routes for pedestrians during ceremonial activities. Did you not see the barriers and signs directing foot traffic away from this area?" Wellington waved dismissively. "Those are just suggestions. This is a public street, and I have every right to use it. Those soldiers had no right to assault me for exercising my rights as a citizen." Several witnesses in the crowd began calling out corrections to Wellington's version of events. "He was warned multiple times," shouted one observer. "The sergeant told him to clear the route, and he refused. He actually tried to order them to stop marching," added another voice. "Told them they'd have to wait for him to finish crossing." Constable Santos began to understand the full scope of what had occurred. "Sir, interfering with a military ceremony is a serious offense. The guards have the right-of-way on their designated routes, and obstructing their march is considered a breach of public order." Wellington's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to growing alarm. "What are you talking about? They're the ones who committed assault. I'm the victim here." "Sir," the constable explained patiently, "the guards were performing their lawful ceremonial duties on a designated route. You deliberately obstructed their march despite clear warnings and commands to move. The contact that occurred was the result of your refusal to comply with lawful orders, not an assault on their part." The crowd around them was growing larger as word spread about the incident. More phones appeared, capturing Wellington's increasing agitation as he realized that the situation was not developing as he had expected. His assumption that the police would automatically side with him against the military was proving to be completely wrong. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Wellington demanded. "This is completely unacceptable. A successful businessman, not some common troublemaker. I pay more in taxes than most people earn in a year, and I deserve to be treated with respect, Constable." Santos made additional notes in her book. "Sir, I'll need to see some identification. And then we'll need to discuss the charges that may be filed against you for disrupting a ceremonial activity and refusing to comply with lawful orders." The word charges hit Wellington like a physical blow, and all his entitled fantasizing about how this situation would be resolved. He had never considered that he might be the one facing legal consequences, the reality that his actions might, have criminal implications was beginning to penetrate his self-absorbed worldview for the first time. 3 months later, Richard Wellington sat in Westminster Magistrates' Court, facing charges of obstructing a public ceremony, disorderly conduct, and refusing to comply with lawful orders. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case that had become a symbol of entitled behavior meeting its inevitable consequences. The video of Wellington's encounter with the grenadier guards had been viewed over 50 million times across various social media platforms, making him internationally famous as the entitled businessman who thought he could stop the Queen's Guard. The footage had been analyzed, memed, discussed on news programs around the world as an example of spectacular arrogance meeting immovable discipline. Wellington's barrister, Patricia Thornfield, faced the difficult task of defending a client whose actions had been recorded from multiple angles and witnessed by dozens of people. Her strategy focused on arguing that Wellington had been confused about the rules and had not intended to cause disruption. Though this argument was undermined by the clear evidence of his defiant behavior and refusal to move when commanded, Your Honor, Thornfield addressed Magistrate Collins during her opening statement. While my client's actions were clearly misguided, they stemmed from confusion about pedestrian rights rather than deliberate disrespect for military traditions. Mr. Wellington is a successful businessman who simply misunderstood the protocols surrounding ceremonial activities. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor James Mitchell, presented a different narrative supported by extensive video evidence and witness testimony. Your Honor, the defendant was clearly and repeatedly warned to clear the ceremonial route. He not only refused these lawful commands, but actively attempted to order serving members of Her Majesty's forces to accommodate his personal schedule. This was not confusion. This was arrogant disregard for British military traditions and public order. When Colour Sergeant Thompson took the stand to testify about the incident, his professional bearing and clear account of events provided a stark contrast to Wellington's continued attempts to portray himself as a victim. Thompson's testimony was precise, factual, and completely devastating to Wellington's defense. The defendant was given multiple clear warnings to clear the route, Thompson testified. When he refused and attempted to command the formation to halt, I followed standard protocol for maintaining ceremonial discipline. The formation continued as trained, treating the obstruction exactly as regulations specify. Under cross-examination, Thompson calmly explained the centuries of tradition behind the guards, ceremonies, and the importance of maintaining discipline and protocol regardless of civilian interference. His testimony made clear that Wellington's treatment had been exactly what anyone blocking a military formation should expect. These ceremonies represent the continuity of British military service and our commitment to royal duties, Thompson explained to the court. Allowing civilian interference would undermine not just the immediate ceremony, but the entire tradition we are sworn to uphold. The video evidence was played multiple times during the trial, each viewing making Wellington's behavior appear more unreasonable and his claims of victimization more absurd. The footage clearly showed him being warned, refusing to move, attempting to command the guards to stop, and then being treated exactly as military protocol required. Several witnesses testified about Wellington's arrogant behavior and entitled attitude during the incident. Their accounts painted a picture of someone who genuinely believed that his personal convenience should take precedence over centuries of military tradition and public ceremony. He actually seemed shocked that they didn't stop for him, testified. Margaret Clark, a tourist who had been recording the ceremony, even after he was knocked down, he kept shouting about how important he was and demanding special treatment. It was the most entitled behavior I've ever witnessed. The magistrate's verdict was swift and decisive. Mr. Wellington, Magistrate Collins addressed the defendant. Your behavior on the morning in question demonstrated a breathtaking level of arrogance and disrespect for British military traditions. You were given multiple opportunities to remove yourself from a clearly designated ceremonial route, and your refusal to do so disrupted an important public ceremony. Wellington was fined £2,000 and ordered to perform 100 hours of community service, specifically working with veterans organizations. to help him develop an understanding of military service and tradition. The magistrate noted that the relatively light sentence reflected Wellington's lack of prior offenses, but emphasized that such behavior would not be tolerated in British society. Your sense of personal entitlement does not supersede the rights of our military personnel to perform their ceremonial duties with dignity and respect, the magistrate continued. Perhaps working with veterans will help you develop an appreciation for service and sacrifice that extends beyond your own immediate convenience. The aftermath of the case followed Wellington long after the legal proceedings concluded. His business suffered significantly as the viral video and news coverage damaged his reputation with clients and partners who were embarrassed to be associated with his behavior. Several major contracts were canceled, and his company's revenue dropped by over 60% in the year following the incident. Wellington was forced to sell his Manchester office and downsize his operations significantly. The man who had once demanded that elite soldiers accommodate his schedule found himself struggling to maintain the lifestyle and status he had taken for granted. The community service work with veterans, initially viewed as punishment, gradually became an education in humility and respect that he had never received. 2 years later, much different Richard Wellington could occasionally be seen at ceremonial events in London, standing respectfully behind barriers and observing military traditions with the appreciation that should have guided his behavior from the beginning. His encounter with the Grenadier Guards had become a powerful lesson not just for him, but for millions of people worldwide who had watched his humiliation and learned something about the importance of respect, humility, and understanding that some things are more important than personal convenience. The incident became a training case study used by tourist organizations, embassy staff, and cultural education programs to help visitors understand the significance of British military traditions and the importance of following protocols during ceremonial events. Wellington's spectacular failure to recognize authority beyond his own entitlement had inadvertently served to educate people around the world about the proper respect due to those who serve their country with honor and distinction.